Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses as we continue with Part 6, Influence of Judaism on the Ancients, Part 1, Gnosticism and its Sources, From the Gnostics and Their Remains, Ancient and Medieval by C.W. King. Influence of Judaism on the Ancients. People in these times are still so influenced by the ideas engendered by the 15 centuries of ecclesiastical regime, during which hatred and contempt for the Jewish race formed an important Christian virtue, that they entirely overlook the influence exercised by Judaism over the minds of the heathen world, so long as the temple stood and the national worship was celebrated there in all its glory. When the Romans, by their conquest of Syria and soon after of Egypt, came into direct contact with the Jewish nation, although they disliked them individually, yet they conceived an intense admiration for their ancient, mysterious, and solemn worship. But in fact, every institution, hallowed by the stamp of antiquity, immediately commanded the respect of the genuine old Roman. The emperors lost no time in gaining a new patron of mighty and undefined power in Jehovah by instituting a daily sacrifice to be ever offered at their own cost on behalf of themselves and empire. The discontinuance of this sacrifice by the faction of the Zealots, which had taken possession of the temple, is noted by Josephus as the consummating act of the Great Revolt and attempt to re-establish independence, which brought down final destruction upon Zion. To give a few examples of the hold Judaism had taken upon the imaginations of the highest classes in Rome, whence its vastly magnified power over the minds of the vulgar may be calculated according to the well-known rule of proportion in such matters. To mark Augustus's freedom from superstition, Suetonius quotes the circumstance of his highly commending the conduct of his grandson Caius, his heir apparent, because during his visit to Egypt and Palestine, he had forborne to visit Apis in the one and the temple in the other country. Putting the two religions in this way upon an equality of itself demonstrates the high place then held by the Jewish in popular estimation. For by that time the Egyptian, as the chapter upon the Serapis worship will show, had to a great extent superseded the worship of the national deities of Rome. Fuscus Aristeus, a friend of Horace's, and therefore to be supposed a person of consequence and of education, makes it his excuse for not attending to a business matter that the day happened to be the Sabbath, and that he was a little superstitious, like many others. The influence and numbers of the Jews actually residing at Rome under the Republic is strikingly exhibited by some observations of Cicero in his oration in defense of Flaccus. Flaccus, when commanding in Asia, had prohibited the sending of money to Jerusalem. This money can only mean the tribute paid by each adult Jew to the temple of half a shekel or 2 drachmae a head. Flaccus seized the money that had been collected for the purpose in defiance of his edict, amounting at Apamea to nearly 100 pounds weight of gold, at Laodicea to 20, the only gold piece of the age being the stater, current for 25 drachmae, and of the weight of 50 to the pound. These collections would give us 50,000 tribute payers at the former city and 10,000 at the other. The orator considers this auri Judaici invidia so damaging to his cause that he explains the circumstances in a whisper to the jurymen in order not to excite the indignation of the Jews amongst his audience. He actually declares that Flaccus's enemies had managed that his cause should be tried in that particular court in order to have the aid of the Jews domiciled in that quarter of Rome to intimidate the jury and so gain a verdict against him. Sequitur auri illa invidia Judaici, hoc nemirum est illud, quod non longe agradibus Aurelius hec causa dicitur. Ob hoc crimen hic locus abste, laeli atque illa turba caesita estimated scis quanta sit manus quanta concordia, quantum valeat in consionibus, submissa voce agam tantum ut judices audient, neque enim desunt qui istos in miatque in optimum quemque incitant quos ego quoidi facilius faciant non adjuvabo, chapter 28. And what is still more surprising, this influence continued to work even after the fall of Jerusalem and the extinction of the people as a nation. Spartianus mentions that Severus in his tour of investigation throughout Asia, when he forbade people to turn Christians, extended the same interdict to the Jewish religion also. Again, to show the natural good-heartedness of Caracalla, he instances his indignation on account of the severe flogging which a boy, his playfellow, had received from his father with the emperor's approbation on the score of his Judaizing. The circumstances of the friendship point out that the boy thus made a confessor must have belonged to one of the best families of Rome. Such a position, yet retained by the religion of Abraham, is almost inconceivable at that late period when it had, besides the vigorous and ever-increasing growth of Christianity, to contend with the varieties of the gnosis which suited themselves to every taste, and in many instances had sprung immediately out of herself, not out of her hated daughter and rival, and, by their union with heathen philosophy, were naturally more attractive to the Gentiles than the original parent. Even at the time when one would have expected the prejudice against anything belonging to that nation to have been the most violent amongst the Romans, we find Vespasian, the actual destroyer of their national existence, erecting a statue in the most honorable of all situations to an Alexandrian Jew, Tiberius, who had assisted him in his attempt to gain the empire in some manner not recorded, but possibly in his capacity of the Rothschild of the age by an opportune loan. It is true that Juvenal cannot repress his indignation of all this prostitution to a foreigner of an honor before confined to the most eminent of his countrymen, and hints it to be the duty of every true Roman to express his sense of the injury by committing nuisances under the very nose of the statue. Atque triumphales inter quos ausus habere nescio quis titulos Egyptius atque alabarces, cujus ad effigiem non tantum meere fas est. In the 3rd century, we find the model emperor Severus Alexander setting up the image of Abraham by the side of Christ and Orpheus, all considered as the divinely inspired founders of the several schools of mystery, or to go to the probable root of the belief as so many different Buddhas, in the most holy recess of his domestic chapel. A little research amongst the annals of the later emperors would no doubt furnish many other examples of the hold taken by various particulars of the Jewish creed, in its Babylonian and Alexandrian phases, upon the religious notions of the Romans. The fact is easily accounted for when men's ideas upon the nature of the soul, of God's government, and of a future state are entirely vague, as were those of the educated heathen of those times, when old traditions being discarded as mere unsatisfying poetical fables. They attempted to build up systems that should explain every difficulty by the help of reason and philosophy alone, although destitute of any solid grounds upon which to lay the first foundation of the fabric. Things being in this state, a religion venerable by its antiquity, itself an impenetrable shield against the shafts of infidelity, as even Tacitus concedes, Hieraitus quoquo modo inducti, antiquitate defenduntur, possessing a complete system that solved every problem by a professedly divine revelation, totally setting itself above reason and human experience, but proclaiming unquestioning credence as the most meritorious of virtues. Such a religion could not but gain the victory over its disorderly and discordant competitors, which had nothing but arguments deduced from probabilities and analogies wherewith to oppose it. The same contest we behold passing under our own eyes. Roman Catholicism, with its doctrines overthrown, exploded, rejected by reason, learning, and philosophy, for the space of 3 centuries, is again rapidly bringing back into her fold her lost sheep, which, having wandered through the tempting ways of Protestantism, and of philosophy or infidelity, however people choose to call it, and unable to discover any reason that will bear the test for standing fast at any ultimate point as the absolute truth, at last return weary and disappointed to whence they started, and find it conducive to peace of mind to accept assertion for demonstration, and the age of a tenet as equivalent to its truth. There is yet another consideration that is of great importance in the present inquiry, which is the close affinity between the Judaism of this period and Magian, the extent of which will be pointed out in the following sections when we come to speak of the Talmud. Remembering how much of the machinery of the one was borrowed from the other, there is little cause for astonishment at discovering that what are generally considered peculiarly Jewish titles of deity upon relics may rather be attributed to a Magian source. The 3 circumstances thus briefly adduced, namely the direct influence of the religion of Zion as a mystery of the most venerable antiquity, vying with those of Egypt and of Babylon, its subsequent indirect influence through its offshoots, which left its visible impress upon things tangible, the virtue of its connection with the creed of the Magi, the secret priesthood, or rather Freemasons of the ancient world, These are the things solving the difficulty that must have struck any inquiring mind when beginning to study the so-called Gnostic remains. From the foregoing considerations, at least a plausible reason may be gathered for the fact of the Hebrew names of the deity and of his angels and of the patriarchs, so perpetually being repeated on works presenting the figures of genii and of astral spirits, forms of idol monsters, the most repugnant, one would have thought, to the feelings of the worshippers of those sacred names, profaned by such union, and imagery, from beholding which the true follower of Moses must certainly have recoiled in horror. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.